The morning sunlight streamed through the tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors of courtroom 342. Judge William Hariss adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, his fingers trailing over the stack of cases before him. At 62, he prided himself on running the most efficient courtroom in the district. Time was currency, and he spent it sparingly. "Next case," he called out, his voice carrying the weight of 28 years on the bench. The court officer announced the name. "Sarah Jenkins, Your Honor." Sarah Jenkins rushed through the heavy wooden doors, her designer heels clicking against the floor. Despite her hurried entrance, she carried herself with unmistakable poise. Her charcoal gray suit was impeccably tailored, and her natural hair was styled in a professional twist. The leather briefcase in her hand bore subtle scuff marks, signs of frequent use rather than neglect. "You're 4 minutes late, Miss Jenkins," Judge Hariss remarked without looking up, his pen tapping rhythmically against his desk. The morning light caught his silver hair, creating a halo effect that contrasted with his stern expression. "My sincere apologies, Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice steady and clear. "There was a 3-car accident on Highway 40, and emergency services head." "Ms. Jenkins," Judge Hariss interrupted, finally looking up. His blue eyes narrowed slightly as he surveyed her. "This court begins precisely at 9:00 a.m. The traffic on Highway 40 is not this court's concern." Sarah straightened her shoulders, maintaining her composure. "Yes, Your Honor. Regarding the speed camera citation, I have documentation showing that my vehicle was." Judge Hariss raised his hand, cutting her off again. "The citation clearly shows you traveling at 48 miles per hour in a 35 zone. The photographic evidence is irrefutable." "Your Honor, if I may," Sarah attempted once more, reaching into her briefcase. "The camera's calibration report from that week shows." "Ms. Jenkins," Judge Harris's voice carried a sharp edge now. Several other waiting defendants shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "This is a simple matter. The evidence is clear. The fine will be $400, plus court costs." A subtle ripple of surprise moved through the courtroom. The standard fine for similar violations rarely exceeded $200. Sarah's expression remained neutral, though her fingers tightened slightly around the handle of her briefcase. "For the record, Your Honor," she said carefully, "I would like to note that I prepared evidence regarding the camera's calibration status." Judge Hariss was already writing on his docket. "Noted. Pay the fine within 30 days. Next case." As Sarah turned to leave, a young law clerk at the side of the courtroom caught her eye. The clerk glanced down at her phone, then back at Sarah, her eyes widening with recognition. But Sarah was already walking toward the exit, her steps measured and deliberate. In the courthouse hallway, Sarah paused to check her phone. 3 missed calls from the U.S. Attorney's Office and a text message. "AUSA Jenkins, don't forget you're presenting the keynote at the Federal Judiciary Awards dinner tonight. Chief Justice Thompson specifically requested your speech on modern justice and equal application of law." A slight smile crossed Sarah's face as she tucked the phone away. She had 5 hours to prepare her speech, finish her federal briefing, and change for the dinner. The traffic fine paper felt heavy in her pocket, but it wasn't the money that bothered her. It was the familiar pattern she'd observed in that courtroom, one she'd spent her career working to address. The morning sun had climbed higher now, eliminating the shadows in the hallway. Sarah Jenkins stepped into the elevator, already mentally revising the speech she would deliver that evening. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel sparkled with elegant chandeliers and the subtle gleam of judicial pins on dark robes and suits. Judge William Hariss stood at the podium, adjusting his bow tie while scanning the evening's program. After 28 years on the bench, these ceremonies had become routine, until tonight. And now, the Chief Justice announced, "To present our award for excellence in federal prosecution, please welcome the Honorable Judge William Hariss." Hariss approached the podium with practiced confidence, smoothing his speech notes before him. The room hushed as he began speaking, his voice carrying across the perfectly arranged tables. The recipient of tonight's award has demonstrated exceptional dedication to justice, he began, his eyes tracking across his notes. With a 98% conviction rate in civil rights cases and landmark victories in. He stopped mid-sentence. There, rising from table 7, was a familiar figure in a deep blue evening gown. The same woman he'd dismissed so curtly that morning. Sarah Jenkins. But now, her name was preceded by Assistant United States Attorney in elegant script on the program before him. The silence stretched for 3 long seconds. Judge Hariss felt a bead of sweat form at his temple as the full weight of the morning's interaction crashed over him. In the audience, Sarah's expression remained perfectly professional, though a slight raise of her eyebrow suggested she was well aware of his recognition. "I apologize," Hariss recovered, clearing his throat. "As I was saying, Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Jenkins has demonstrated exceptional dedication to justice throughout her career." As he continued reading the citation, memories from that morning played through his mind in vivid detail. His dismissive tone, the excessive fine, the way he'd cut off her attempts to present evidence. Each word of her impressive achievements now felt like a personal rebuke. Sarah approached the podium with graceful confidence. The same poise she'd shown in his courtroom now commanded the entire ballroom. As she passed him to accept the award, she gave a small professional nod. "Thank you, Judge Hariss." Taking her place at the podium, Sarah adjusted the microphone. "Thank you, Your Honor," she began, a subtle emphasis on the honorific that wasn't lost on Hariss. "And thank you to the Federal Judiciary Committee for this recognition." From his seat at the presenter's table, Hariss watched as she delivered a masterful speech about justice, fairness, and the importance of equal treatment under the law. Her words weren't pointed or accusatory, but each carefully chosen phrase seemed to illuminate his morning's behavior in stark relief. "In our pursuit of efficiency," she said, making eye contact with various members of the audience, "we must never sacrifice our duty to hear every voice, consider every piece of evidence, and ensure that justice is truly blind to everything except the facts before us." Judge Hariss found himself sinking slightly in his chair, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. After her speech, during the polite applause, he noticed several colleagues glancing between him and Sarah, their expressions suggesting they'd heard about the morning's traffic court incident. As the evening drew to a close, Hariss watched Sarah graciously accepting congratulations from various legal luminaries. The contrast between her morning appearance in his courtroom and her evening role as a celebrated federal prosecutor created a cognitive dissonance he couldn't shake. When she finally passed by his table, she paused briefly. "I look forward to presenting that camera calibration evidence at the appeal hearing next week, Your Honor," she said quietly, offering a small, knowing smile before moving on to speak with the Chief Justice. Judge Hariss loosened his bow tie slightly, reaching for his water glass with an uncharacteristically unsteady hand. Tomorrow's traffic court sessions, he realized, would need to be handled very differently. Back in his chambers late that evening, Judge Hariss sat in his leather chair, his bow tie undone and hanging loosely around his neck. The events of the day weighed heavily on his mind as he reached for the remote control that operated the courtroom's security footage system. With a deep breath, he pressed play. The screen flickered to life, showing the morning's proceedings. His own voice filled the room, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. As he watched his interaction with Sarah Jenkins unfold, he noticed details he'd missed in the moment: her perfectly organized documentation, the way she maintained composure despite his interruptions, the subtle reactions from others in the courtroom. "Pause," he muttered, freezing the frame on his own face as he cut off her explanation. The expression he saw surprised him. Stern, yes, but there was something else, an automatic dismissiveness he hadn't recognized in himself before. He pressed play again, this time focusing on his patterns throughout the entire morning session. A knock at his chamber door startled him. "Come in," he called, quickly straightening in his chair. his longtime clerk, Maria Rodriguez, entered with a stack of files. "Judge Hariss, I have tomorrow's docket, but there's something else you should see." She hesitated before placing a folder on his desk. "These are the statistics from your traffic court sessions over the past year." Hariss opened the folder, his eyes scanning the carefully compiled data. The numbers told a story he couldn't ignore, a pattern of consistently higher fines and fewer opportunities for explanation given to certain defendants. The evidence was there in black and white, backed by meticulous documentation. "Maria, how long have you been tracking this?" he asked quietly. "6 months, Your Honor," she replied, standing straight. "I noticed the pattern and felt professionally obligated to document it." He nodded slowly, respect for his clerk rising. "And you chose tonight to show me this. After what happened with AUSA Jenkins, I thought you might be more receptive to seeing it now." Hariss turned back to the frozen image on his screen, then looked down at the statistics again. Years of legal training had taught him to follow evidence where it led, especially when it was uncomfortable. He reached for his phone, opening his calendar app. "Maria, clear my morning schedule tomorrow. I need you to pull every traffic court session from the past month. And," he paused, making a decision, "schedule a meeting with the court's implicit bias training coordinator." "Yes, Your Honor," Maria replied, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Alone again, Hariss rewound the footage to the beginning of Sarah Jenkins' appearance in his courtroom. This time, he watched with new eyes, taking notes on a legal pad. With each passing minute, his handwriting became more intense, filling page after page with observations, not just about this case, but about his general conduct, his assumptions, his reflexive reactions. Near midnight, he finally turned off the screen. His desk was covered with notes, statistics, and self-analysis. The prestigious judicial awards from his career seemed to watch him from the walls, their glass surfaces reflecting the dim light of his desk lamp. He picked up the $400 citation he'd issued to Sarah Jenkins. After a moment's contemplation, he began writing on a fresh sheet of his official letterhead. "Dear Assistant U.S. Attorney Jenkins, I write to apologize." He paused, crossed it out, and started again. "Dear Ms. Jenkins, today I was forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about myself." The clock struck midnight as he continued writing, each word a step toward acknowledging what his evening of reflection had revealed. Sarah Jenkins sat in her federal office, surrounded by stacks of meticulously organized court records. Her corner office on the 15th floor offered a panoramic view of the city, but her attention was focused entirely on the documents before her. Her standard case files had been temporarily pushed aside for this personal project. "Ms. Jenkins," her assistant Michael poked his head in. "I have those courthouse records you requested. 5 years' worth of Judge Hariss decisions, all categorized by case type and demographic data." Sarah looked up from her computer, where she'd been analyzing patterns in the judge's recent rulings. Perfect timing. "What about the comparative data from other judges in the district?" Michael placed another thick folder on her desk. "All here. And something interesting. Judge Hariss' conviction rates and sentencing patterns shifted significantly about 3 years ago. They became notably more rigid." Sarah raised an eyebrow, reaching for the folder. "Around the time his wife passed away," she murmured, more to herself than Michael. She'd done her homework on the judge's background. "Any major changes in his clerk staff during that period?" "Just one," Michael replied, consulting his tablet. "Maria Rodriguez. She's been documenting some interesting patterns herself." Sarah nodded, making a note. She wasn't interested in destroying the judge's career. Her goal was understanding and change. The more she dug, the more she saw not malice, but a man who had gradually isolated himself, letting grief harden into inflexibility. Her phone buzzed. A message from Maria Rodriguez herself. "AUSA Jenkins, I showed him the statistics last night. He's been reviewing footage all morning. Cancel traffic court." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. The judge was doing exactly what she'd hoped, looking inward without being forced. She turned to the window, contemplating her next move. The easy path would be filing a formal complaint, but that would likely only result in defensive posturing rather than genuine change. Her computer chimed with an email alert. Opening it, she found a message from Judge Hariss himself. "Dear Ms. Jenkins, I would appreciate the opportunity to discuss your traffic court appearance and any other matters you feel pertinent. At your convenience." The formal language didn't mask the underlying message. He was ready to talk. Sarah checked her calendar, then began typing a response. As she wrote, she glanced at a photo on her desk. Herself as a young law student, standing proudly with her mentor, the first black female federal judge in their district. Change happens one conversation at a time, her mentor had always said, but you have to be ready with more than accusations. Bring solutions. Sarah turned back to her computer, pulling up the innovative judicial training programs she'd researched. Several districts had implemented successful bias awareness initiatives. The data was promising. When judges were presented with clear evidence and given practical tools for change, many showed significant improvement in their decision-making patterns. Her office door opened again. Hariss Jenkins. It was her supervisor. "The Attorney General's office is interested in your judicial reform proposal. They want a presentation next month." Sarah nodded, already seeing how all the pieces might fit together. "Thank you. And please clear my schedule for tomorrow morning. I have a meeting with Judge Hariss." As her supervisor left, Sarah began organizing her findings into a clear, compelling presentation. She included not just the problems, but potential solutions. The goal wasn't to shame, but to illuminate and improve. She would help Judge Hariss see his blind spots, but she would also show him a path forward. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across her desk as she worked, preparing for what she hoped would be a conversation that could change more than just one judge's perspective. At precisely 9:00 a.m., Sarah Jenkins stood outside Judge Hariss' chambers, her presentation materials tucked neatly in her leather portfolio. She had chosen a deep purple suit today, professional yet approachable. Before she could knock, the heavy wooden door opened. "Hariss Jenkins, please come in," Judge Hariss said, his usual authoritative tone softened slightly. He had aged somehow in the past few days, the lines around his eyes deeper than she remembered from court. The judge's chambers were exactly as she'd imagined, law books lining the walls, degrees hanging precisely aligned, and a large desk that had witnessed countless legal discussions. A coffee service had been set up on a side table, steam rising from 2 china cups. "Thank you for agreeing to meet, Ms. Jenkins," Hariss began, gesturing to a comfortable chair across from his desk. "I believe I owe you." Before we discuss the traffic court incident, Sarah interjected smoothly, setting up her laptop. "I'd like to share something with you." She turned the screen toward him, displaying a graph. "This represents 5 years of data from your courtroom." Hariss leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. His expression shifted as he absorbed the information. Statistical evidence of patterns he never noticed, or perhaps had chosen not to see. "These numbers," he said quietly, "they're quite thorough." "They are," Sarah agreed, clicking to the next slide. "But what's more interesting is this." The screen showed a timeline of his sentencing patterns, with a marked change 3 years ago. "Judge Hariss, would you tell me about your wife?" The question caught him off guard. He sat back, removing his glasses. "Helen. She was also an attorney. Public defender. She passed 3 years ago." Sarah nodded gently. "She handled cases in your district." "Never in my courtroom. We were strict about that. But she..." He paused, understanding dawning in his eyes. "She used to tell me when I was being too harsh. Over dinner, she'd mention if she'd heard about any of my rulings seeming unfair." After her passing, Sarah continued carefully, "Your sentencing patterns became more rigid across all demographics, but with a noticeable disparity in certain cases." She placed a folder on his desk. "However, your record before that shows something different. a judge known for careful consideration and measured decisions. Hariss opened the folder with slightly trembling hands. Inside were letters from defendants whose lives had been positively impacted by his earlier rulings, his careful attention to circumstances, his willingness to listen. "I'd like to show you something else," Sarah said, pulling up another document. "These are success stories from districts that have implemented comprehensive judicial review programs. Not punitive measures, but collaborative approaches to ensure equal justice." For the next hour, they discussed the data, the patterns, and most importantly, the solutions. Hariss asked questions, took notes, and gradually his defensive posture relaxed. Finally, he stood and walked to his window, looking out over the city. "You know, Ms. Jenkins, you could have filed a formal complaint. It would have been justified." Sarah joined him at the window. "Sometimes justice isn't about punishment, Your Honor. It's about restoration and growth." He turned to face her. "Helen would have liked you," he said quietly. Then, more formally, "I believe you have a proposal for moving forward." Sarah smiled, returning to her laptop. "Actually, I have several. And with your experience and insight, I believe we could create something that would benefit the entire district." As they began discussing specific reforms, the morning sun brightened the chamber, casting new light on old precedents, illuminating a path forward that neither had expected when the day began. 2 weeks after their meeting, Judge Hariss found himself in an unfamiliar setting. Instead of his elevated bench in the courthouse, he sat in a folding chair in the Highland Park Senior Center. Sarah Jenkins stood beside him, addressing a room full of elderly residents. "Judge Hariss has joined us today to hear your experiences with the court system," Sarah explained, her voice warm and inviting. An elderly woman named Dorothy raised her trembling hand. "Last year, I got a ticket for an expired registration," Dorothy began. "My Social Security check hadn't come in yet, and I couldn't afford the renewal. When I tried to explain in court," she glanced at Hariss, who nodded encouragingly. "Well, I wasn't even able to finish my sentence." Hariss felt a familiar pang of recognition. How many stories had he cut short? How many circumstances had he dismissed? Later that afternoon, they visited the Youth Development Center, where teenagers shared their perceptions of the justice system. A young man named Marcus stood up, his school uniform neat but worn. "It's like, we're guilty before we walk in," Marcus said. "My brother got a fine for jaywalking last month. Same day, same corner, I watched this business guide do the same thing. Nothing happened to him." Hariss found himself taking notes, not on legal precedents or case law, but on human experiences. Sarah watched silently as he engaged with each speaker, asking questions, really listening perhaps for the first time in years. The next stop was a local diner. "Best pie in the city," Sarah promised. They sat in a booth, surrounded by the afternoon crowd of factory workers and office staff ending their shifts. "Helen and I used to come to places like this," Hariss said suddenly, stirring his coffee. "Before I became a judge. We talk about her cases, my cases, about making a difference." Sarah set down her fork. "Tell me about your favorite case together." 1992. She defended a young mother accused of theft. "I was still in private practice. Helen was frustrated because the judge wouldn't consider the woman's circumstances. 3 kids, abusive husband, desperate for diapers and food." He smiled faintly. "Helen challenged me to think about what justice really meant in cases like that." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion at the counter. A young woman was frantically searching her purse, her face flushed with embarrassment, as she came up short for her bill. Without hesitation, Hariss stood and walked to the counter. Sarah watched as he quietly paid the woman's bill, waving away her tearful thanks. When he returned, something in his expression had shifted. "You know," he said, "sitting on that bench, you start to feel removed from all this." He gestured at the diner's busy scene. "You forget that every case is actually about people." Sarah nodded. "That's why these visits matter. Each story, each face, each situation. They're all part of the bigger picture of justice. As evening approached, they made one final stop at a high school graduation ceremony. In the audience, they watched as a young man walked across the stage, the son of a woman Hariss had once sentenced. Despite the hardships, despite the fine that had strained their family's resources, here was a success story. "Tomorrow," Sarah said as they left the ceremony, "we'll be back in the courthouse. But now you've seen what's really at stake in each decision." Hariss paused in the parking lot, looking up at the stars becoming visible in the darkening sky. "You know, Ms. Jenkins, I've been on the bench for nearly 3 decades, but I think I learned more about justice today than in all those years combined." Sarah smiled. "Then we're just getting started." 1 month after their community visits, Judge Harris's courtroom had undergone a subtle but significant transformation. The wooden benches remained the same. The seal of justice still hung prominently, but something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere. Case number 247. The clerk announced, "James Thompson, speeding violation." A young man approached the bench, nervousness evident in his posture. Instead of immediately launching into the charges, Hariss leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Thompson, please tell me what brought you here today." The gallery stirred with surprise. Even the court officers exchanged glances. This was not the Judge Hariss they knew. "Your Honor," Thompson began, his voice shaking, "I was rushing to the hospital. My daughter had an asthma attack at school." He fumbled with his phone, pulling up messages from that day. Previously, Hariss would have cut him off. Today, he listened. "Do you have documentation from the hospital?" "Yes, sir." Thompson presented the emergency room papers, time-stamped. Hariss reviewed them carefully. "While I understand the emergency, speeding endangered others, I'm reducing the fine and requiring you to attend a driver's safety course. Sometimes there are better ways to handle emergencies. The course will teach those methods." In his chambers during lunch, Hariss reviewed the morning's cases with Maria, his clerk. On his desk sat a new edition, a small plaque reading, "Justice sees with the heart as well as the eyes," a gift from Sarah Jenkins. "The new assessment guidelines are making a difference," Maria noted, showing him the latest statistics. "More consistent sentencing across all demographics, but with appropriate consideration for circumstances." Hariss nodded, examining the data. The numbers showed improvement, but more importantly, they showed balance. His phone buzzed. A message from Sarah. "Committee meeting at 2. Bringing the Chief Justice." The afternoon found them in the main conference room. Sarah stood before a panel of judges, presenting their pilot program results. Hariss watched with quiet pride as she outlined the changes they'd implemented in his courtroom and the measurable impacts. "Our goal," Sarah explained, displaying a series of graphs, "isn't to be lenient or harsh, but to be just. Every case deserves proper consideration of its unique factors." The Chief Justice leaned forward. "And you've seen measurable improvements in public trust." "Yes," Hariss spoke up, rising to join Sarah. "We've tracked not just the statistics, but the responses. Support for our courts has increased significantly. People feel heard, even when the ruling doesn't go their way." After the presentation, as other judges gathered around Sarah with questions, Hariss noticed a familiar face in the doorway. Dorothy from the Senior Center, accompanied by her grandson in a police uniform. "Judge Hariss," she called out, making her way over. "I wanted you to know. My grandson here helped me set up autopay for my registration. No more expired tags." She smiled warmly. "And I told my friends at the center how you've changed." That evening, alone in his chambers, Hariss looked at an old photo of Helen on his desk. "You'd be proud of this one," he murmured. Then he turned to his computer, beginning work on a proposal to expand the program to other districts. A knock at his door revealed Sarah, holding 2 cups of coffee, ready to review tomorrow's training materials. Hariss smiled, clearing space on his desk. "You know, Ms. Jenkins, when you first came into my courtroom that day, I thought I was the one in the position to judge. Turns out, I was the one who needed guidance." Sarah sat down, opening her laptop. "Justice is a journey. Your Honor, we're all still learning. 1 year later, the National Judicial Conference buzzed with anticipation. The main hall was packed with judges, prosecutors, and legal professionals from across the country. On stage, Judge William Hariss and AUSA Sarah Jenkins prepared to deliver their keynote address. It began with a traffic ticket. Hariss started, drawing quiet laughter from the audience. Or rather, it began with my mistake, one that turned out to be the most valuable lesson of my career. Sarah stepped forward, her presence commanding yet warm. What Judge Hariss and I discovered was that true justice isn't just about following the law. It's about understanding the human stories behind each case. The giant screen behind them displayed their program's results. A 40% increase in public trust in the courts, more consistent sentencing patterns, and higher satisfaction rates even among those who received adverse rulings. Last month, Hariss continued, a young lawyer appeared in my courtroom. She was representing a client in a minor offense case. Instead of rushing to judgment, I listened. Turns out, she had uncovered a pattern of incorrect citations affecting dozens of people in her neighborhood. Sarah smiled, picking up the thread. That lawyer was able to help her entire community because one judge took the time to listen. This is how justice should work. In the audience, Maria Rodriguez beamed. She'd just been appointed as a magistrate judge herself, carrying forward the lessons she'd learned while clerking for Hariss. After their presentation, during the reception, a group of law students gathered around Sarah and Hariss. One raised her hand. But how do you balance efficiency with taking time to hear everyone's story? Hariss exchanged a knowing look with Sarah before answering. You know, I used to think efficiency meant speed. Now I understand that true efficiency means getting it right the first time. Later that evening, they stood on the conference center's balcony, looking out over the city lights. Sarah handed Hariss a document, statistics from their district's latest review. Look at page 3, she said with a smile. Hariss adjusted his glasses. The data showed that other judges had voluntarily adopted their methods, creating a ripple effect throughout the system. More importantly, the numbers revealed something extraordinary. Their district now had the highest rate of public confidence in judicial fairness in the state. You know, Hariss mused, Helen used to say that justice is like a garden. It needs constant attention and care to grow properly. She was right, Sarah replied. And speaking of growth, the Attorney General's office called. They want to implement our program nationally. Hariss turned to her, extending his hand. Ms. Jenkins, do you remember the traffic fine I gave you? $400, she answered promptly, plus court costs. Best mistake I ever made, he chuckled. Though I believe you still haven't paid it. Sarah reached into her briefcase and pulled out the original citation, now framed. I thought this belonged in your chambers, as a reminder. The next morning, as they prepared to present their final workshop, Hariss watched Sarah guiding a young judge through their training materials. He thought about how far they'd come from that first morning in traffic court. His phone buzzed. A message from Maria about a new initiative she was starting in her courtroom, inspired by their program. Below it was a photo from the senior center, showing Dorothy teaching other seniors how to use the court's new online system. Ready for the next session? Sarah asked, approaching with their presentation notes. Hariss stood, straightening his robe. You know, Ms. Jenkins, I think we're just getting started. Together, they walked toward the conference room, where another group of legal professionals waited to learn how one traffic ticket had sparked a revolution in judicial fairness.